In the unforgiving heart of the American West, a single act of mercy could cost you everything. This isn't a story about cowboys and gunfights. It's about a choice that echoed across the plains and sealed the fate of 2 worlds. It's the story of a young widow, alone and forgotten, who finds a man bleeding out in the snow. He was a stranger, an enemy in the eyes of her people. But in her heart, he was just a man in need. What she didn't know was that this dying stranger was Concealing, the great raven, a war chief, a legend, and the leader of 1,000 Lakota warriors who were at that very moment tearing the territory apart to find him. This is the story of how her secret act of compassion put her at the center of a storm that would change the frontier forever. The silence of the Dakota Territory was a living thing. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the whisper of wind through lodgepole pines, the distant cry of a hawk, and the heavy, oppressive weight of memory. For Hannah Thompson, the silence was the sound of her husband, Thomas. It had been 8 months since the mine collapsed, 8 months since the silence had swallowed his laughter and left her in this small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. A tiny speck of defiance against a vast, indifferent wilderness. At 22, Hannah felt ancient. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from chopping wood and tending her meager garden. Her face, which Thomas had once compared to a prairie, Rose felt pale and pinched from a diet of salted meat, preserved vegetables, and loneliness. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the space a vibrant woman once occupied. The winter of 1876 had come in with a snarl burying the Black Hills under a merciless blanket of white. A blizzard had been raging for 2 days, a furious, howling entity that shook the very timbers of the cabin. The windows were frosted over, turning the world outside into an abstract blur of grey and white. Inside the fire in the hearth was her only companion, its crackling voice a meager defense against the storm's roar, and the louder silence in her heart. On the 3rd morning, the wind died down to a mournful sigh. A fragile, blue-tinged light filtered through the cleaned glass, promising a respite. Hannah, wrapped in one of Thomas's heavy wool coats, forced the cabin door open. The snow was piled high, sculpted by the wind into magnificent, treacherous drifts. The world was pristine, beautiful, and deadly. It was while she was checking the integrity of her small animal pen, a rooster and 3 nervous hens, her only livestock, that she saw it. At first it was just a stain, a dark, ugly blotch on the otherwise perfect canvas of snow near the dense line of pines that marked the edge of her cleared land. It looked like a wolf had made a kill a common enough sight. Yet something about it was wrong. It was too large, too still. Curiosity, a long dormant instinct, warred with the ingrained fear that kept survivors alive on the frontier. Fear told her to go back inside, bolt the door, and forget what she'd seen. But the memory of Thomas, a man who never shied from a challenge, pushed her forward. She cinched the coat tighter and began the trek, her boots sinking deep into the powdery snow. Each step was a labor. As she drew closer, the stain resolved itself into a shape. Not an animal. A man. He was lying face down, a cascade of jet-black hair, fanned out against the snow, stark and shocking. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt, clothing wholly inadequate for the blizzard's fury. He was Lakota, an Indian. Every horror story she had ever heard screamed through her mind. The newspaper accounts from Bismarck, the hushed whispers of other settlers in the now distant town, the tales of raids of Custer's Fall at the Little Bighorn just months ago. They were spoken of as specters, a savage, faceless enemy. To find one here on her land was like finding a wolf sleeping on her hearth. Her first impulse was primal. She turned ready to flee back to the safety of her cabin. But as she did, a low groan wrenched from the very depths of him cut through the cold air. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the most human sound she had ever heard. She stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and something else. Pity. Compassion. The woman who had nursed her own father through the lung fever, who had sat with neighbors through childbirth and death, was still in there, buried under the grief and fear. Slowly, cautiously, she approached. She knelt in the snow, her knees instantly soaked and cold. With a trembling hand, she reached out and brushed the hair from his face. His skin was the color of burnished copper, drawn tight over high, sharp cheekbones. A jagged, blood-matted cut ran along his temple, but it was the dark, spreading stain on his side that told the real story. He'd been shot. The snow beneath him was a gruesome slush of red and brown. His eyes fluttered open. They were as black as obsidian, and for a fleeting moment they were lucid. They held not hatred, but a raw, desperate confusion. Then they rolled back, and he was unconscious again. The choice was laid bare before her in the stark morning light. Leave him. Leave him for the elements or for the wolves that would surely be drawn by the scent of blood. It was the sensible thing to do. The safe thing. Bringing a Lakota warrior, and he was clearly a warrior, into her home was an act of madness. If he lived, he might kill her. If he was found, any white man, be it a prospector or a cavalry patrol, would condemn her, perhaps even harm her as a traitor. She looked at his face again, at the lines of pain etched around his mouth. She thought of Thomas lying broken in the dark earth of the mine. Had anyone shown him a moment of mercy in his final hours? Had a hand reached out to him? Damn it all. She whispered the words, a puff of white in the frigid air. Damn it all to hell. Getting him back to the cabin was a Herculean task. He was tall and leanly muscled, a dead weight that seemed to anchor him to the frozen ground. She wasn't a large woman, but she was strong. She looped her arms under his, planting her feet, and pulled. He moved an inch. She grunted, her breath tearing at her lungs, and pulled again. Snow, dirt, and blood. She dragged him foot by agonizing foot across the 50 yards that separated her from the cabin. It felt like 50 miles. The scent of his blood was thick in her nostrils. By the time she hauled him over the threshold, she was shaking with exertion and fear, her back screaming in protest. She managed to get the door closed, shutting out the cold and the judging eyes of the wilderness. The cabin, her sanctuary, now felt like a small one she had willingly entered with a predator. She dragged him close to the fire, the heat immediately beginning to melt the snow caked into his buckskins. His breathing was shallow, ragged. Now came the part she truly dreaded. She had to tend to his wounds. Her hands shook as she took a knife to his shirt, cutting away the soaked, blood-stiffened material. The wound on his side was ugly. A ragged hole, bluish at the edges, oozing dark blood. The bullet was still in there. His torso was a landscape of old scars, faint white lines that spoke of a life of conflict. But this new wound was angry and fresh. The gash on his head was just as bad a deep slice that would need stitching. She worked like a woman possessed, her fear channeled into a frantic, focused energy. She stoked the fire, until the cabin was almost unbearably hot. She melted snow for water and put it on to boil. From a small carved wooden chest, she took out Thomas's things: a razor, a bottle of whiskey, and her sewing kit with its precious needles. It felt like a violation to use them for this stranger, this enemy. But what choice did she have? Cleaning the wound was the worst. Each time she touched him, his body would flinch and a low moan would escape his lips. The water turned pink, then red. She poured a generous amount of whiskey directly into the wound. The man's body arched in a silent scream, his hands clenching into fists. His eyes flew open, blazing with a moment of pure, unadulterated fury and pain, before closing again. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Tears freezing on her cheeks as she stood on her porch for a moment of air. "I'm so sorry, but it's the only way." Probing for the bullet was a nightmare. Her fingers, clumsy and trembling, followed the path of the lead ball into his flesh. She could feel it lodged against a rib. Using 2 small spoons from her kitchen, sterilized in the boiling water, she tried to work it out. Sweat beaded on her forehead, stinging her eyes. For what felt like an eternity, she struggled. Finally, with a sickening scrape, the flattened piece of lead came free, falling onto the wooden floor with a soft clink. She slumped back on her heels, gasping for breath, her entire body trembling. The ordeal was not over. She stitched the wound on his side with tight, practiced motions, her needle dipping in and out of his skin. Then she cleaned and stitched the gentry on his head, his black hair making the task difficult. When she was done, she bandaged him with strips torn from one of her own clean petticoats. Exhausted, she sat in the chair opposite him, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. He lay on a pallet of blankets, his breathing still shallow but more regular now. In the flickering firelight, stripped of his warrior's context, he looked different, younger, vulnerable. His face, even in its unconscious state, was proud and severe, a face carved from granite and hardship. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. What had she done? She had brought the war into her home. She had harbored an enemy of the state, a man who belonged to the people everyone feared and hated. She looked at the rifle Thomas had left her mounted above the fireplace. It was loaded. For the rest of the day and into the long, dark night, she sat her vigil torn between her role as a nurse and her instinct as a potential victim. She watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, listening to every breath, her hand never far from the heavy iron poker by the hearth. She had saved his life, but in doing so, she had almost certainly risked her own. The silence of the cabin was no longer just about Thomas. It was now filled with the presence of the stranger and the terrifying unknown future he represented. As dawn broke, painting the snow outside in shades of rose and gold, the Lakota man's eyes opened. This time they stayed open, and they were fixed on her. The fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, pulsating light that did little to warm the room. The dawn, pale and hesitant, was the only other illumination. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Hannah was frozen in her chair, the iron poker still clutched in her hand, its weight a cold, inadequate comfort. The man on the floor simply watched her, his black eyes holding an unnerving stillness. There was no fear in them, nor was there the overt aggression she had anticipated. There was only a deep, penetrating watchfulness, an assessment so intense it felt as if he were seeing past her skin and into the frantic, terrified beating of her heart. His gaze was a physical weight pinning her to the chair. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, but her limbs were made of lead. The silence stretched thin and taut, threatening to snap. It was a different silence from the one she had grown accustomed to. Her lonely silence was a vast, empty expanse. This was a charged, predatory silence, filled with unspoken questions and the palpable threat of violence. Slowly, deliberately, he moved. The motion was slight, just a tensing of his shoulders as he tried to push himself up. A sharp hiss of pain escaped his lips, and his face contorted. His hand went to the bandage on his side, his fingers brushing against the foreign texture of her petticoat strips. His eyes flickered down to the wound, then back to her. The question was there, clear, as if spoken aloud. "You did this." Hannah found her voice, though it came out as a dry, cracking whisper. "Lie still. You'll tear the stitches." He obviously didn't understand her words, but he understood the tone. His expression didn't soften, but the immediate tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He stopped trying to rise instead, turning his head to take in his surroundings. He scanned the small cabin with the same methodical intensity he had applied to her. His eyes lingered on the rough-hewn table, the single cot in the corner that was her bed, the meager shelves of tinned goods, and finally the long rifle mounted above the hearth. His gaze rested on the gun for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, before returning to her. The poker in her hand suddenly felt foolish. What was it against a man who had likely faced down dozens of such rifles? She forced her fingers to relax, placing the poker carefully back on the hearthstones. It made a soft clinking sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room. She saw his eyes track the movement. He missed nothing. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her training as a caregiver, the ingrained instinct to tend to the sick, was a powerful counterforce. He was weak, feverish. She could see a faint sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the cabin's chill. He needed water. She rose from the chair, her movements slow and deliberate, as if trying not to startle a wild animal. She kept her hands visible away from her body. She went to the bucket of melted snow, her back to him, for a terrifying second. Every instinct screamed that she was exposed, vulnerable. She could feel his eyes on her spine. She filled a tin cup, her hand shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim. When she turned back, he had managed to push himself up slightly, his back resting against the stone base of the fireplace. The effort had clearly cost him. His breathing was more labored, and a new dampness was spreading on the bandage at his side. She cursed herself for not anticipating this. She approached him as one would approach a cornered wolf. She stopped a few feet away, holding out the cup. "Water," she said, her voice still thin. He stared at the cup, then at her face. The mistrust was a palpable barrier between them. To him, she was a Washichu, a white woman. Her people were the ones who had shot him, who were stealing his land, killing the buffalo, and tearing his world apart. To accept anything from her, even water, was a concession, a risk. What if it was poisoned? The standoff continued for a heart-stopping minute. Hannah's arm began to ache. She wouldn't force him. The choice had to be his. Finally, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, he reached out a hand. His fingers were long and surprisingly elegant, but they trembled with weakness as they closed around the cup. He brought it to his lips and drank, his throat working. He drained the cup completely, the sound of his swallowing loud in the still air. He held the empty cup for a moment before extending it back to her. His fingers brushed against hers as she took it. His skin was hot, confirming her fears of a fever. The brief contact sent a jolt through her, a strange spark of shared humanity in the midst of their silent war. She took the cup and retreated to the relative safety of her chair. A fragile, unspoken truce had been declared. She would not harm him, and he, for the moment, was too weak to harm her. They spent the next hours in this state of suspended hostility. Hannah busied herself with small, quiet tasks, mending a tear in her dress, oiling Thomas's boots, all the while hyper-aware of the man by the fire. She made a thin broth from salted beef and dried herbs, the smell filling the small cabin. When it was ready, she poured it into a bowl. This time the ritual was slightly less fraught. She set the bowl on the floor near him along with a spoon. He watched her every move, but when she retreated, he pulled the bowl closer and began to eat. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if husbanding his strength. The hours bled into one another. The sun reached its zenith, casting a bright, cold light across the snow-covered landscape outside. The world was deceptively peaceful. Inside the cabin, the tension remained. As the afternoon wore on, his fever worsened. He drifted in and out of a restless, murmuring sleep. In his delirium, he spoke. The words were in his own tongue, a river of guttural sounds and soft whispers that she could not understand. But she could understand the tone. There was pain in his voice and anger, and something that sounded like a name repeated over and over. Thashunke. Thashunke. She did what she could. She bathed his forehead with a cool, damp cloth. At one point, as she leaned over him, his eyes snapped open. He grabbed her wrist, his grip astonishingly strong for a man so injured. Panic seized her. His eyes, clouded with fever, burned into hers. He said a single word, sharp and urgent. Kangi. He held her gaze for a beat longer, then his strength seemed to desert him. His hand fell away, and he lapsed back into unconsciousness. Hannah stumbled back, her heart hammering, rubbing her wrist where the ghost of his grip remained. Kangi. The word meant nothing to her, but the intensity with which he'd spoken it was terrifying. It sounded like a command or a name. His name, dusk, began to fall, painting the cabin in shades of orange and purple. The fever broke near midnight. She knew the moment it happened. 1 minute he was shivering, and muttering the next he was still, his breathing evening out into the deep, regular rhythm of true sleep. The heat radiating from his body subsided. He had survived the crisis. Hannah felt a wave of profound relief wash over her, so potent it left her weak. It was a completely irrational feeling. This man's survival only deepened her own peril. Every day he remained here, the risk of discovery grew. And what would happen when he was strong again? Would the nurse be replaced by the hostage, or the victim? She looked at him, sleeping peacefully now, in the firelight. His face, relaxed in sleep, had lost some of its harshness. The proud lines of his cheekbones and jaw were softened. He looked less like a fearsome warrior and more like a man who had bled on her floor, drank from her cup, and whose life she had held in her hands. She had crossed a line. In finding him, in dragging him from the snow, in tending to his wounds, she had irrevocably tied her fate to his. She went to the window and scraped away a small patch of frost. The moon was high and bright, illuminating a world of stark, silent beauty. But somewhere out there, under that same moon, were his people. Were they looking for him? And somewhere else, perhaps, were the men who had shot him. What would they do if they found him here? With her. She let the frost reclaim the glass, shutting out the vast, dangerous world. Her sanctuary had become her prison, shared with an enemy she had saved. She was no longer just the widow Hannah Thompson, living out her quiet, lonely life. She was something else now, something far more complicated and far more dangerous, and she had no idea what to do next. The days that followed the breaking of the fever settled into a strange and brittle rhythm. The silence in the cabin remained, but its character changed once more. It was no longer the empty silence of loneliness or the charged silence of predation. It was a silence of observation, a quiet, intricate dance of two people from warring worlds trapped by injury and circumstance in a space no bigger than a horse stall. The man the warrior healed with a speed that astonished Hannah. His body, honed by a life of hardship and constant motion, seemed to know instinctively how to knit itself back together. The angry inflammation around the bullet wound on his side began to recede, and the gash on his temple slowly closed, though it would surely leave a stark, new scar to join the collection that mapped his torso. He was awake now, truly awake. The fever dream haze was gone from his eyes, replaced by that same piercing, intelligent watchfulness. He spent most of the first few days of his recovery in stillness, not from weakness alone, but from what Hannah perceived as a profound internal focus. He would sit for hours propped against the hearth, his gaze distant as if his spirit were traveling over the snow-covered plains, seeking his lost kin. Their communication was a clumsy pigeon of gesture and intent, a pointed finger at the water bucket, a nod of thanks, a hand gesture indicating hunger. Hannah found herself becoming a student of his economy of motion. He never made a superfluous movement. Every action was precise, deliberate. When she changed his bandages, he would endure her touch with a stoicism that was more intimidating than any outburst. He would watch her fingers as she cleaned the wound and applied a fresh dressing of boiled herbs, his expression unreadable. One afternoon, as she was replacing the bandage on his side, her fingers brushed against a long, silvery scar that ran diagonally across his ribs. It was old, perfectly healed. On impulse, she traced its path lightly with her fingertip. His body went rigid. His eyes, which had been fixed on the fire, snapped to her face. She immediately pulled her hand back, her heart leaping into her throat. She had overstepped, crossed some invisible boundary. She expected anger, a sharp retort in his own tongue. Instead, after a tense moment, he surprised her. He raised his own hand and, using his index finger, pointed to the scar. Then he made a sharp, swiping motion in the air and grunted a low, guttural sound that was unmistakably the sound of a bear. He then pointed to another smaller, pock-marked scar on his shoulder and mimicked the flight of an arrow. A new language was being born between them, a language of scars. Each mark on his body was a letter in the alphabet of his life, and he was teaching her how to read it. He was not just a warrior. He was a survivor. The next day, he was strong enough to stand. He rose from the floor with a slow, deliberate grace, using the stone mantel of the fireplace for support. He stood for a long moment, testing his legs, his tall frame seeming to shrink the already small cabin. Hannah watched, her breath held from the far side of the room. He took a single halting step away from the fire, then another. The pain was evident in the tight set of his jaw, but so was his indomitable will. He walked to the single window, his back to her, and looked out at the vast, white world. He stood there for a long time, a solitary, powerful silhouette against the pale light. Hannah couldn't imagine what he was thinking. Was he plotting his escape? Was he mourning the freedom he saw just beyond the glass? When he finally turned back, his gaze fell on the lump of charcoal she used to light the kindling. He gestured toward it. Wary, she picked it up and held it out to him. He took it from her, his fingers closing around the small black stick, and then knelt with some difficulty on the rough plank floor. He began to draw. His first strokes were uncertain, but soon a shape emerged from the black dust. It was a horse, not just any horse, but a creature of magnificent spirit and power. He drew its head high, its mane flowing like a river, its eyes walled and intelligent. It was a portrait filled with a fierce, possessive love. When he was finished, he looked up at her, then pointed to the drawing and tapped his own chest. He spoke a word, the same name she'd heard in his fever dream, but this time it was spoken with a quiet, heart-breaking reverence. Tashunke, my horse. Then he drew an arrow piercing the horse's flank. He looked at Hannah, his eyes dark with a pain that went deeper than his own wounds. He had not been alone when he was attacked. They had killed his horse, his companion, his Tashunka. The loss was a palpable grief in the small cabin. He looked at her then, a direct and challenging gaze. He tapped his own chest again. Kangi, he said, the word he had spoken in his fever. It was his name. He said it again clearly, so she would understand. Kangi. Raven. A name. He had given her his name. It was a gift, an offering of trust across a chasm of blood and hatred. She knew she had to offer one in return. Hannah, she said, her voice soft. She pointed to herself. My name is Hannah. He tried to repeat it. Lara. The sounds were foreign on his tongue, but he said them. For the first time since she had dragged him from the snow, a flicker of something other than pain or suspicion crossed his face. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was a softening, a moment of genuine human connection. The dynamic in the cabin shifted. He was no longer just the stranger, the enemy. He was Kangi, and she, to him, was Hannah. As his strength returned, so did a restless energy. He began to pace the confines of the cabin like a caged panther, his long strides eating up the small space in an instant. The cabin, her sanctuary, was beginning to feel more and more like his cage. She knew he couldn't stay. She knew he wouldn't stay. The question of his departure hung between them, unspoken but ever present. The first sign of the outside world's intrusion came a week after she'd found him. She was outside gathering firewood from the small stack against the cabin wall when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness. The sharp metallic ring of shod hooves on frozen stone carried on the crisp winter air. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the wood and scrambled to the edge of the clearing, hiding behind the thick trunk of a pine tree. Peering through the branches, she saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the morning sun, making their way slowly up the valley pass that led towards her property. They were white men, dressed in heavy buffalo coats and slouch hats. Prospectors, most likely, or trappers. Or worse. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She flew back to the cabin, her heart pounding against her ribs. She burst through the door, her face a mask of terror. Kangi was on his feet instantly, his hand instinctively going to his wounded side. He saw the look on her face and needed no words. He went to the window, peering cautiously through a small, clear patch in the corner. He saw the riders, and his body tensed, the warrior instinct taking over completely. He turned to her, his eyes blazing. He pointed to the rifle above the hearth. His meaning was clear. "Give me the weapon." Hannah's mind reeled. The riders were getting closer. If they found a Lakota warrior in her cabin, they would kill him without a second thought. And what they might do to her for harboring him. She couldn't bear to imagine it. Giving him the rifle was one option. He could fight. But it would be 3 against 1, and he was still injured. It would be a bloodbath right here in her home. There was another choice. A terrible choice. She could give him up. She could walk out there, tell them she had a wounded Indian captive. They might even reward her. She would be safe. He would be dead. She looked at him. Kangi. The man whose life she had saved. The man who had shown her his scars, who had drawn his beloved horse on her floor, who had shared his name with her. She looked at the trust in his eyes, the trust that she would do the right thing. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No. She pointed frantically towards the small root cellar, its door a set of heavy planks set into the cabin floor, hidden beneath a bearskin rug Thomas had cured. Get in. Now. Hide. He stared at her, uncomprehending. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the rug, her terror giving her strength. She threw the heavy rug back, revealing the iron ring of the cellar door. She pulled it open, revealing a dark, musty-smelling hole. Please, she begged, using the universal language of desperation. Hide. The sound of the hoofbeats was closer now, accompanied by the crunch of snow and the low murmur of men's voices. There was no more time. Kangi looked from the dark hole to her face, then back to the window. He understood. This was not a betrayal. This was a concealment, an act of conspiracy. He gave her a single, sharp nod. Without another sound, he lowered himself into the cellar. Hannah's hands trembled as she closed the heavy doors over him, plunging him into darkness. She quickly pulled the bearskin rug back into place, smoothing it down. She took a deep breath, trying to still the wild hammering of her heart. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to appear calm, ordinary. Just a lonely widow in her isolated cabin. A heavy, authoritative knock sounded on the door. It felt like a hammer blow to her own chest. "Anyone home?" a gruff voice called out. "We see your smoke. We're in need of a hot drink and directions, if you'd be so kind, ma'am." Hannah stood frozen in the middle of the room, the floorboards beneath her feet, separating her from the man she was now hiding. She had made her choice. She was no longer just a nurse. She was an ally. And the enemy was at her door. For a paralyzing moment, Hannah could do nothing but stare at the rough-hewn planks of her own door. The voice on the other side was deceptively cordial, but beneath the veneer of politeness lay the hard edge of assumption. They saw smoke, so they assumed welcome. They were men, so they assumed the right to ask to enter. Under her feet, the floorboards felt impossibly thin, a fragile membrane separating her dangerous secret from the intrusive world. The silence from the cellar was absolute, yet she could feel Kangi's presence as a solid, waiting weight. Drawing a breath that felt stolen, she forced her feet to move. She smoothed her apron with trembling hands, a gesture of domesticity she hoped would mask the terror that was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She schooled her features into a look of weary resignation, the face of a widow interrupted, not a conspirator discovered. She lifted the heavy iron latch and pulled the door inward just enough to see them. 3 men sat astride their horses, their figures large and imposing against the brilliant snow. The man who had spoken was clearly the leader. He was older, with a grizzled beard, stained brown with tobacco juice at the corners of his mouth. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were sharp and missed nothing. He wore a heavy buffalo coat that had seen better years and a hat with a brim so low it cast his face in permanent shadow. He introduced himself as Jedediah Kane. The other two were younger. One was a broad, hulking man with a vacant expression, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. The other was wiry and nervous, his gaze darting about, taking in the cabin, the woods, the sky, everything but Hannah herself. Ma'am Kane said, his lips barely moving. He didn't dismount. "Sorry to trouble you. Name's Kane. Me and my partners are tracking a claim up north. Storm set us back. Wondered if you could spare a bit of hot coffee and point us on the right path to the Deadwood Trail." His eyes weren't on her, but were scanning the clearing, taking in the small animal pen, the woodpile, the single set of tracks, hers leading from it. It was the detached professional assessment of a predator sizing up a territory. I don't have any coffee," Hannah said, her voice tighter than she wanted. "But I can boil some water." "For tea?" Kane's gaze finally settled on her, and she felt pinned by its intensity. "Tea would be fine. Mighty neighborly of you." It wasn't a request. He swung a leg over his horse and dropped to the ground with a thud. The other two followed suit, their movements clumsy in comparison. Hannah had no choice but to open the door wider. "Please come in and warm yourselves by the fire." They stomped the snow from their boots on her doorstep before entering, bringing the sharp, cold scent of pine and horse with them. They filled the small cabin with their presence, their bulk and their noise, shrinking the space until Hannah felt she couldn't breathe. They huddled near the hearth, soaking in the warmth, their eyes roaming over every detail of her small home. Hannah turned her back to them, her movements stiff as she hung the kettle over the fire. Her mind was racing. Did I get all the blood? Is there anything out of place? Can they smell him? The root cellar, covered by the heavy bearskin rug, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Mighty isolated out here for a woman alone. Kane observed his voice a low rumble. He picked up the second tin cup from the table, the one Kang Gi had used. He turned it over in his hands. "You get many visitors?" "Almost none," Hannah replied, focusing on the kettle. "My husband, Thomas," he passed. "In the mine collapse last spring. I keep to myself mostly." She let her voice crack slightly, a performance of grief that was painfully easy to summon. The hulking man grunted in something that might have been sympathy. Kane, however, was silent. He set the cup down. "Sorry to hear that, ma'am. Hard country for a man, let alone a widow." "You seen any trouble lately? Any Indians?" The word hung in the air, thick and venomous. Down below in the damp, earthy darkness, Kang Gi was perfectly still. The muffled sounds from above were a foreign landscape he navigated with his ears. He heard the heavy tread of the Washichu boots, the low rumble of their voices, Hannah's higher, strained tones. He smelled the musty earth of the cellar, the faint scent of potatoes and cured meats. He had not wanted to hide. His every instinct had screamed to fight, to meet the enemy with weapon in hand. But he had seen the terror in Hannah's eyes, and he had understood. This was her home, her territory. He had trusted her strategy. Now he listened, his hand resting on the handle of the knife she had not known he'd kept tucked in his legging. If her voice turned to a scream, he would burst from this hole and spill their blood on her floor, and damn the consequences. "No," Hannah said, her voice steady, despite the frantic pounding in her chest. "I've seen no one. Nothing but deer and wolves." Kane walked around the small room, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He stopped near the bearskin rug. "Fine specimen," he commented, nudging the edge of it with his toe. Your husband's work? Yes, he was a good hunter. Seems a strange place for it. Right in the middle of the floor. Kane mused, his sharp eyes narrowed. Don't you trip on it? I'm used to it, Hannah said quickly. Too quickly. The nervous, wiry man, whose name she learned was Billy, shivered dramatically. Gives me the creeps, thinking of them savages out there. They say a war party of Sioux tore up a freight convoy over on the Cheyenne River 2 weeks back. Looking for someone, they say. Some chief of theirs went missing. Kane's head snapped around. That? So Billy? A chief. His eyes bored into Hannah. You hear anything about that, ma'am? Hannah shook her head, her throat suddenly dry. She busied herself with the tea, her hands shaking so much she spilled some of the precious dried leaves. She could feel Kane's eyes on her back. He knew she was lying. He might not know what the lie was, but the scent of it was in the air, as strong as the herbs she'd used on Kangi's wound. The water finally boiled. As she poured it, she made a decision. It was a gamble, a desperate, reckless play. I may not have coffee, she said, turning to face them, a fragile smile on her lips. But my Thomas, he did leave behind a bottle of very fine whiskey. I imagine you men are colder than tea can fix. Perhaps a dram for your journey. The mood in the room shifted instantly. The hulking man's face lit up, and even Billy looked interested. It was Kane she was watching. He stared at her for a long, calculating moment. He was a predator who had sensed weakness, a flaw in the prey's defense. Now a new, more tempting offer was on the table. Greed warred with suspicion in his pale eyes. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Well now, ma'am, an offer of good whiskey is an offer a Christian man can't refuse. That is mighty generous of you. Hannah retrieved the bottle and 3 glasses from a high shelf. Her hands were steady, now her purpose clear. As she poured the amber liquid, she was acutely aware of Kangi beneath the floor listening. She had offered them sustenance. She had played the part of the grieving widow, and now she was offering them the drink that would dull their senses, cloud their judgment, and hopefully get them out of her home. They took the whiskey and drank it down, their gruff thanks echoing in the small space. They asked for directions, and she gave them her voice, clear and even. As they prepared to leave, Kane paused at the door. You take care of yourself, ma'am, he said, his voice low. He pulled on his gloves, his eyes doing one last sweep of the room. They rested for a fraction of a second too long on the bearskin rug. This is no place for a woman on her own. The world is full of dangers you can't even imagine. The threat was unmistakable. He tipped his hat and walked out into the blinding snow, his men trailing behind him. Hannah stood at the door and watched until the sound of their horses faded completely, until the silence of the wilderness rushed back in to reclaim the clearing. Only then did she bolt the door. She sagged against it, her body trembling with the aftermath of her performance. The floorboards beneath her no longer felt thin. They felt like the most solid thing in the world. She stumbled to the bearskin rug and with fumbling hands threw it back. She lifted the heavy cellar doors. Kangi was already standing at the bottom of the ladder, his face cast in shadow. He climbed out, his movements fluid and silent. He stood before her in the quiet cabin, the air still thick with the lingering scent of the intruders. He had heard everything. The lie she had told, the fear in her voice, the way she had protected him. He looked at her, and his eyes for the first time held something other than watchfulness or pain. It was a look of profound, startling understanding. He raised a hand and gently, almost reverently, touched the place on her cheek where a single terrified tear had escaped and frozen in the cold. The gesture was more intimate than any touch they had yet shared. She had not given him the rifle. She had hidden him. She had chosen a lie over violence, conspiracy over betrayal. In the crucible of those terrible few minutes, a new, unbreakable bond had been forged between them. She was no longer just his nurse. She was his protector, and in the heart of the unforgiving West, she had made an enemy of Jedediah Kane, a man who would not forget the woman in the lonely cabin, or the lie he felt sure she was telling. The departure of Jedediah Kane didn't bring relief. It left a lingering dread, heavier than winter's chill, filling the cabin with tension. Hannah's fragile peace was shattered, replaced by anxious anticipation. Kane's suspicion was not gone, merely delayed. They knew he would return. The relationship between Hannah and Kangi shifted profoundly. Roles blurred, leaving them as partners bound by a shared lie, their fates intertwined. Kangi regained his strength, preparing methodically. He showed Hannah tactical details, the table's defensive potential. The creak of the third floorboard. One afternoon, he took Thomas's rifle from above the fireplace, handling it with chilling expertise. Outside in the snow, he taught her more than survival hunting. He showed her the stark, grim technique of killing in self-defense. Their lesson was steeped in sorrowful intimacy. 4 days later, as dusk painted the valley in crimson and gold, Kangi sensed danger first. He froze alert and silent. Hannah saw his transformation from partner to warrior. "He comes," he warned, voice low. At the window, she spotted Kane approaching, leading a dozen men. Their intent was clear. Fear surged. She whispered, "The cellar." Kangi shook his head firmly, placing a reassuring hand over the rifle she held. "No more hiding," he said resolutely. His calm steadied her turning fear into cold determination. Together they took positions behind the cabin walls, watching the posse encircle them. Kane's voice shattered the quiet. "Hannah Thompson. Send out the Sioux chief, or we'll burn you out." Shock jolted Hannah Chief. She glanced at Kangi, understanding the truth of his identity. He stood firm, expression unwavering. "He is my guest," Hannah shouted defiantly. "You trespass here! Leave now!" Kane laughed cruelly, signaling his men to light torches. But before flames touched the cabin, a deep rumble filled the valley. Kane's posse turned stunned toward the ridge above. Over the horizon appeared a single rider silhouetted against the setting sun, followed by countless others. Hundreds of Lakota warriors crested the ridge, flooding the slopes in disciplined silence, encircling the clearing. Kane's men froze in terror. Calmly, Kangi stepped forward into full view. His presence commanding instant recognition from the warriors, who roared a fierce salute. He was indeed Kangi Tanka, the great raven leader of 1,000 warriors. The chief raised a hand, silencing his warriors immediately. He spoke first to his people, praising Hannah's mercy, then faced Kane. He spoke in measured English voice, devoid of hatred, brimming instead with firm authority. "You came seeking gold, but found only greed. Death would be too easy. You and your men will live. Leave the Paha Sapa, these sacred hills. Never return. If you do, the land itself will claim your blood." Dismissively turning away, Kangi signaled the end. Cain and his posse, humiliated and terrified, fled hastily. In the fading twilight, warriors lingered on the ridge, watching silently. Kangi approached Hannah. Realizing their paths diverged irrevocably, she whispered, "You must go." He nodded gently. "My path is with my people. Yours remains here. This ground is now Wahala sacred. No Lakota will harm you. You shall be known as Wingyan Wachang Tognaka." What does that mean? The woman who keeps compassion in her heart. He took her hand, briefly expressing deep gratitude. It was a quiet farewell, acknowledging a profound debt. Without further words, he mounted a black pony brought by his warrior and rode toward the waiting warriors on the ridge, never looking back. Alone again, Hannah stood by her cabin in a profound silence, no longer lonely, but powerful. Her small home, once a place of sorrow, was now a fortress protected by honor and legend. She had become Wingyan Wachang Tognaka, the solitary queen guarded not by locked doors, but by a chief's honor and the respect of 1,000 warriors. The story of Hannah and Chief Kangi Thanka is a testament to the fact that even in the most brutal of times, in the heart of conflict and hatred, a single act of courage and compassion can ripple outward, changing the course of history in ways we can never predict. It reminds us that our shared humanity is a force more powerful than any border, any law, or any weapon. Hannah's choice to see a man instead of an enemy didn't just save a life. It forged a legend and sanctified a piece of the unforgiving West. If this story of honor, courage, and the unlikely bond that transcended two warring worlds moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a powerful tale from the heart of the past. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that uncover the hidden histories and unsung heroes that time has forgotten. Thank you for listening.